Hello everybody, this is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and today we're going through some small tips and tricks for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Limited. I've drafted this set upwards of 60 to 70 times by now, and there are some small niche interactions that I think newer, less experienced players can benefit from hearing. This format's not for everyone, I definitely get that, but committing some of these tips and tricks to mind can help avoid some of the pitfalls that can completely ruin a game for you. As always, before we jump into the list, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more limited content and cube-related content, and if you're interested in chatting with like-minded limited players, come join us using the Discord link in the description below. Alright, here are 10 tips and tricks to up your Forgotten Realms game. We'll start off our list with a pretty obvious interaction that I see players overlook quite often. That is, Magic Missile cannot be countered, so you do not have to pay ward costs when targeting with Magic Missile. Now, if you're playing on Arena and you do target a ward creature with Magic Missile, the game will still come up with a prompt asking if you want to pay the ward cost or not. You can choose no to not pay the cost, and your spell will still resolve as normal. We saw this same interaction in Strixhaven with Owling Shield Mage and Heated Debate. As with Magic Missile, Heated Debate couldn't be countered, but I'd still see players pay the 3 life for the ward trigger when targeting my Shield Mage with their Heated Debate. Ward is an evergreen mechanic, so we're likely to see this interaction come up in future sets as well, so keep an eye out for removal spells that can't be countered. While we're on the topic of ward, let's talk about when you should be interacting with your own ward triggers, another play pattern that I see players mess up from time to time. Let's assume you're the one with the ward creature, your opponent is targeting it with removal, and you've got some sort of interaction in hand like a pump spell or a sacrifice effect. You should always allow the ward trigger to resolve and have your opponent pay the cost before you interact. If you sacrifice your creature to a deadly dispute with the ward trigger still on the stack, your opponent will simply decline to pay the cost. However, if you allow the ward trigger to resolve, your opponent will have to pay the cost, then you'll have another window of opportunity to cast whatever spell you're holding. This is fairly straightforward, but I've noticed players interacting a bit too soon when I try to remove their ward creatures from the board, giving me an easy opportunity to opt out of the ward cost. I've played a ton of this set by now, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've ventured into the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. I understand that I play a fair bit more than the average player, but having attended some recent FNMs at my local game store, it seems that players are venturing into this dungeon way more often than they should be. As a default, you should almost always choose Lost Mines of Phandelver when you venture, especially if your deck is only capable of venturing a few times during an average game. Tomb of Annihilation comes up from time to time, but only if you're playing an aggro deck, if your opponent's close to dead, or if you're incredibly far ahead on board. Dungeon of the Mad Mage should not be on your radar at all, except in a few uncommon circumstances. A, you need the 1 life from the Yawning Portal immediately, or you'll lose the game. Or B, the life from the Yawning Portal will trigger a life gain payoff that has a meaningful effect on the game. For example, untapping a Lurking Roper or growing a Celestial Unicorn. Aside from these circumstances where the initial 1 life is important, it's almost always better to venture into the Lost Mines, even in decks that are capable of venturing over and over again. The benefit of completing the Mad Mage seems enticing, but in the 7 steps it takes you to finish that dungeon, you could complete Lost Mines once and already be halfway through completing it a second time. This is especially important if you have cards like Cloister Gargoyle or Barrowin, which are at their best if you've completed a dungeon. With just 3 ventures, Lost Mines will usually give you a Scry, a Goblin token or Treasure if needed, and a +1/+1 counter, whereas Mad Mage will give you no tangible board presence until at least the 5th venture. And this is a format where board presence matters immensely. It's no secret that red-black sacrifice is the boogeyman of the format. It ranges from an all-in treasure deck to the typical Rakdos steal and sacrifice deck that we're used to for the color pair, and a single deck can play early offense while grinding into the late game at the same time. You should draft this deck when open, and you should expect to play against it quite often. When you do run into the mirror match, it's usually pretty important to play around the card Price of Loyalty, the Act of Treason variant of the set, and the card that single-handedly makes the sack and steal aspect of the deck tick. It's pretty useful to try and keep Deadly Dispute up and at the ready so that you can sacrifice your own creatures in response to a price of loyalty. You'll still lose that creature, obviously, but your opponent won't get the benefit of hitting you and sacrificing your creature for value. Likewise, if you're the one trying to steal the opponent's creatures, it's important that you clear cards like Sepulchral Ghoul or Skullport Merchant off the board first, and watch out for the opponent's instant speed Deadly Disputes. Playing digitally versus playing in paper comes with its own unique set of quirks and interactions that are sometimes easy to exploit on Arena. One of these quirks is the priority system on Arena, which will stop when you have a spell you could cast, even if it doesn't make much sense to cast it. Every set seems to have a 1-mana spell that completely gives itself away when the game gives the opponent priority on turn 1. In Forgotten Realms, that card seems to be Dueling Rapier. If the opponent leads with turn 1 Mountain and the game doesn't auto-pass their turn, they're either holding Goblin Javelineer or Dueling Rapier, and well, you'll know if it's the Javelineer soon enough. Strixhaven had a similar situation where an opponent who led with turn 1 Mountain on the play and passed would receive priority if they were holding Shock or Lightning Bolt, and you could use that information to better plan out your turns and play around a cheap removal spell. If you're in the position where you're on the play and you have a Dueling Rapier in your opening hand, you could try lead in with a land other than a mountain to mask the fact that you're holding the equipment. Earthcult Elemental is an average card that you'll play from time to time, and half the time it'll force both you and your opponent to sacrifice a permanent. Any permanent is up for grabs, and the Elemental more often than not ends up nabbing a land or token from each player. However, there are times where a creature is locked down with an enchantment, and here it's important to know one of the rulings for Earthcult Elemental. See, players choose in turn order which permanent they want to sacrifice, and each subsequent player will know the choice made by the previous player before they pick what they're gonna sacrifice. If you're the active player and you resolve the elemental, you pick first, your opponent sees what you picked, then they choose, and both permanents get sacrificed simultaneously. With cards like Charmed Sleep, Ray of Frost, and Minimus Containment, the order matters to some extent. Let's say you've got a Charmed Sleep on your opponent's creature and they resolve an Earthcult Elemental, choosing the frozen creature to sacrifice. You can then choose the Charmed Sleep since it'll be going away anyway, and leave your other permanents intact. It doesn't quite work the other way around though. In the same scenario, you've got Charmed Sleep on an opponent's creature and you're the one who resolves Earthcult Elemental, you have to pick first. If you choose your own Charmed Sleep anticipating that the opponent will simply sacrifice their frozen creature, they'll see that decision and choose something else, and you'll end up losing your enchantment and freeing up that creature. This doesn't come up very often, but it's useful information to keep in mind when an effect causes both players to sacrifice permanents. There are a number of cards in this set, mostly in black, that have some end-step trigger if a creature has died that turn. This tip is pretty obvious for any veteran players, but new players might fall into the trap of triggering those abilities when they could have been avoided. See, if an ability of a creature says at the beginning of the end step, do X if a creature has died that turn, a creature has to have already died before getting to the end step for that ability to go off. Look at something like Zombie Ogre, which ventures on end step if a creature's died that turn. If nothing's died by the time you get to the end step, that ability won't happen, even if creatures end up dying during the end step. That means if your opponent is the one with the Zombie Ogre on board and you're holding instant speed removal for a different creature, you can dodge the Zombie Ogre's ability by using your removal spell once the opponent has already entered the end step. The good news is that this is usually when you want to use your removal anyway, so it's not that hard to mess this up. However, with cards like Death Priest and Miracle running around, it's important to avoid giving your opponent free death triggers, and so keeping a keen eye on the phases of the turn becomes pretty important. Precipitous Drop is a pretty straightforward card, and as one of the best commons in the set, I'm sure we've all seen it game in and game out. The shortcut way of thinking about this card is -2/-2 for 3 mana, or -5/-5 for 3 mana if you've completed a dungeon. But I've both been outplayed and have outplayed my opponents with Precipitous Drop alongside other venture cards. 9 times out of 10 you drop the enchantment on a 2 toughness creature to clear it off, or if resolving the aura will result in you completing a dungeon, you can play it on a larger creature and kill most things off with the -5/-5. It's pretty obvious when it's right to do one or the other, but what's not so obvious is setting up an early Precipitous Drop on a larger creature to have it die off later in the game once you've completed a dungeon. See, as soon as you complete a dungeon, Precipitous Drop changes over to giving the enchanted creature -5/-5, even if the aura has been sitting on the creature for the majority of the game. That means you can use Drop to shrink a larger creature, making it less of a threat, then focus on completing the dungeon you're in so that the creature will just naturally die off later in the game. I've seen this come up in games where I'm holding multiple Precipitous Drops in hand. Let's say my opponent has a 2/2 and a 5/5 on board. Some amount of the time, I'll use my first drop on the 5/5, hoping I can block it a bit better and make it less of a threat, then follow up the next turn with the second drop on the 2/2. If that completes a dungeon for me, both of my opponent's creatures will die. The end result is the same, but I might stave off an attack from a 5/5 for a turn by sequencing things this way. This next one is a pretty unintuitive interaction between Minimus Containment and some of the better rares in the set, which I found out the hard way. The rares in question are Mind Flayer and Gelatinous Cube, the former of which steals a creature until it leaves the battlefield, and the latter of which exiles a creature until it leaves, or until its Dissolve ability removes that creature from underneath the cube. Both of these creatures have interesting enter the battlefield abilities in that once the ability resolves, the permanent itself has to be removed from the board in order for the opponent to regain control of their creature. Minimus Containment can target a Mind Flayer or a Gelatinous Cube, but it doesn't actually remove that permanent from play, it simply changes what that permanent is, and so the ability is still in effect. You might think that Minimus Containment would overwrite the effect since the creature loses all of its abilities, but that's not true either. If I put Minimus Containment on my opponent's Gelatinous Ooze while it's holding one of my creatures hostage, then my opponent sacrifices the Treasure Ooze, I still get my creature back even though the Ooze didn't have any abilities when it died. This is because with both Mind Flayer and the Ooze, the trigger that returns the creature to its owner's control is part of the original trigger that removes the creature in the first place. They're not two separate triggers, so once the ability resolves, the effect that gives the creature back to its original owner has already resolved. If the return trigger was its own separate line of text and wasn't tied to the initial ETB, that would be a different story, but that's not the case with either of these cards. So let's say you've correctly ventured into the Lost Mines of Phandelver and you've gone down the left side of the dungeon. You're now faced with the decision of going into the storeroom for a +1/+1 counter or the dark pool where you drain a life from the opponent. Which one do you pick? Well, that entirely depends on what's going on in the game. More often than not, the storeroom is going to be a better pick since it adds something to the board, whereas the dark pool has a minor effect on life totals. If the +1/+1 counter gives you a better attack or a better block, then it's an obvious choice. Likewise, if you triggered the venture mid-combat with something like Planar Ally, then the +1/+1 counter is going to have virtually the same outcome as the dark pool anyway, minus the 1 point of life gain, and will have a permanent effect on your board state. Too often, I see players venture into the dark pool to deal a point of damage to me when the +1/+1 counter would have dealt that extra damage anyway, and left a creature on board slightly bigger. As I mentioned earlier, with the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, there are times where the life gain trigger is more important, and if choosing the dark pool means you get to untap your Lurking Roper or trigger your Cleric class, you should probably be picking that room instead. If I have a card like Trelisara or Celestial Unicorn on board, and the board is fairly even, I'm always picking the dark pool since I'll get the life drain effect and my creature will spot me the +1/+1 counter anyway. Basically, you should default to the storeroom when you're faced with this decision, unless the guaranteed 1 point of damage from the dark pool is likely to matter, or if the point of life gain has some effect on your board state. That's all the big tips and tricks I wanted to cover today, but let's go over a small no-brainer tips to close things out. Think of it like a little bit of a lightning round of sorts. Number 1, if your opponent targets something with Grim Bounty, Improvised Weaponry, or Precipitous Drop, you can sacrifice the target in response and they won't get any of the treasure or other benefits of the card when it fizzles. Number 2, if you're playing cards like Charmed Sleep or Scion of Stygia, while the opponent has a Clever Conjurer out, you pretty much have to target the Conjurer or they're just going to untap whatever you did target. Number 3, you can put Precipitous Drop on your opponent's 2/4 Circle of the Moon Druid and it will die as soon as their turn starts with no opportunity for them to respond. Number 4, Green Dragon kills an opponent's creature whenever it takes any damage the turn it came into play, not just combat damage. You can use cards like Spare Dagger or Tiger Tribe Hunter to pick off larger creatures this way. Number 5, Oswald Fiddlebender can sacrifice treasure tokens to fetch up 1-mana artifacts from your deck. Most of the 1-mana artifacts aren't great, but there are a few playable ones, so keep an eye out for that. Number 6, whenever a creature phases out, all of the permanents attached to that creature phase out with it. You can use Guardian of Faith to save an equipment that your opponent's trying to destroy by phasing out the equipped creature. Number 7, Fate's Reversal can be cast with no targets in a desperation attempt. I hope you never have to do this, but if it means completing a dungeon for some advantage, or finding that missing land drop, it might be an option. Number 8, Eccentric Apprentice can turn the opponent's creatures into 1/1 birds once you've completed a dungeon, which might make them worse blockers. Number 9, if you plan on attacking with a Chaos Channeler, don't play your land first. You can play lands that get exiled with the ability. Likewise, if you plan on using removal to clear a blocker, attack first and see what gets exiled. You might hit a removal spell off the trigger and get to save the one in your hand. And finally, number 10, avoid drafting blue unless you have a bomb rare or a real reason to do so. I could do a whole video on why I stand behind this, but I wanted to throw this in somewhere without making it a whole rant. Blue is really bad in this set by comparison to the other colors, and you need a real incentive to be in a blue deck. Alright folks, that's the video. I know a lot of these tips and tricks are going to come off as very obvious to seasoned players, but a lot of these are small mistakes or gameplay patterns that either I've messed up on or have seen my opponents mess up on, and it felt worthwhile to point some of them out. If you learned anything here or want to see more content like this for future limited sets, let me know in the comments below. If you want to come hang out with some cube enthusiasts and like-minded limited players, there's a link to our Discord page in the description below. As always, thanks for hanging out. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I'll see y'all next time.